welcome to the Shulgin Farm. After the event, maybe we could do a couple of little tours because it's really an amazing place to see. The house has so much history, and the lab is back behind the house, and that is an amazing thing to see where Sasha did all his amazing work. And hopefully Call can stay for giving us a tour through there. But we are in the process of trying to preserve this place because it is so historical. Sasha worked here from about the mid 60s all the way until he passed. He worked with Call for a few years while his eyes went, and he needed an extra pair of hands and somebody to be his eyes. So Paul Daly worked with him for a few years before she passed. But what Sasha did in that lab is amazing. Created over 200 novel psychedelic compounds and so much meticulous research. He was quite a scientist. And so this place is an important place in the history of the psychedelic movement. This is all of our legacy here. And so I'd be very happy to show you after the talk. And so also, if you want to donate to the Shulgin Foundation to help us preserve this place, we are really trying to raise the money to transfer from the family to the foundation. Right now, the family still owns it. So we're really we have a big capital campaign happening right now and really need the support. So shulginfoundation.org is the website, and there's some QR codes around. You can also just go to every.org and donate if you are inclined. And now I'd love to introduce Gül Dölen and Joe Dolce, and Joe's going to take over and introduce, but welcome all of you.
Thanks, Wendy.
Thanks so much, Wendy. Thanks for coming. We are going to record here. Okay, we're going to hope this all works. So I wrote Modern Psychedelics. Can you not hear me? That's unusual. There was a point, anybody here read Michael Pollan's book?
Yeah.
Great, right? So it's called How to Change Your Mind, and it's a very introductory, interesting, personal guide through the world of psychedelics. And it was also a beautifully written and maybe somewhat cautious guide. Michael was not experienced in psychedelics. So having read it, I thought, maybe there's time, maybe we should take this to the next level for those who are interested in actually using these compounds either medically or on their own or in ceremony. Because there was a lot of information, there's so much information in the world about psychedelics, but you just don't know what the source of it is. So my overarching goal was to sort of create a single source that contains science and some ancestral wisdom and some of the wisdom of our elders. Sasha's one of them. And it's a real honor for me to be here because as I was reading the crazy, amazing history of psychedelics, this man's work really stood out. He did create over 200 compounds here. He published 2 massive volumes of work that included the recipes, if you will, for all of the compounds he discovered. And they became the Bible of every underground chemist in the world for really the last 60 years. And he did it not for profit. He wasn't making any money off of these books, and he never sold any of the formulas, okay? So he did the work, he did the research, and the fact that it's still here and preserved and that we can actually see that lab is a miracle. So if you can support the foundation, I want to encourage you to. I also want to encourage you to buy my book. I'm just going to do this once, this promotion. It's a little shameless, but T, my sister-in-law, is back there with a bunch of books. When you write a book like this, you don't get a lot of mainstream attention for lots of reasons. So I really thank you all for posting about it, reading it, writing a review of it, whatever, if it interests you and you want, please do so. That would be really helpful. So the woman to my left is, I think you're just a great human and a great scientist. Gül did her BA at Duke University, and she had an overarching interest in consciousness, which led her to design her own major, on comparative perspectives on the mind, which combined courses in philosophy, neuroscience, linguistics, and religion. Did I leave one out?
A little bit of art.
A little bit of art. That's really important in psychedelics, a little bit of art, right? So she also has a PhD and an MD from Brown and MIT and a postdoc at Stanford. And what can I say? And do you have a degree from Johns Hopkins?
No.
Okay, so she worked at Johns Hopkins for a long time, and that's where the first studies were done. But today she's one of the few women working in the field of neuroscientist, and she is currently a professor of neuroscience at Berkeley, and she has her own lab there. And really, I think her work, starting with Octopuses and Ecstasy, has really given the science of psychedelics a whole fresh take, and really shows us how we could maybe lift the hood on consciousness a bit. So, has it been a long, strange trip for you?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
Tell us how your interest in, well, let's start here at the farm. What was your interest in Shulgin? I mean, as a person who studied psychedelics and psychedelic science.
Yeah, so I met Sasha and Anne at MIT actually when I was a graduate student. They had come to give a talk. Well, Sasha was talking, and it was sort of a prestigious event. A new building had been opened, and people had invited all of these Nobel laureates and Sasha to give talks. And the Nobel laureates were, talking about all kinds of random things that didn't really have anything to do with neuroscience. And Sasha got up there, and he's the same age as everybody else, but he's definitely the most lucid. And he is, talking about how, I just moved the methyl group from over here to over here and changed consciousness in this way. And all the neuroscientists were just amazed, right? Because this is sort of the dream of neuroscience, that you could unlock the mysteries of consciousness using a physicalist approach, and that was very much, kind of the promise of being able to take a molecule, change consciousness. That to me was personally some of the best evidence I could think of for, a physicalist, materialist explanation for consciousness. And so I had already sort of formulated that back when I was in college. But seeing Sasha kind of talking about it and talking about how many different molecules he could play around with and achieve these remarkable things, really, I think, nailed it for me. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
And how did that spark an interest in psychedelics for you as well, as fascinating molecules that are untamable and bigger than most everything we know?
Yeah. So that actually started a little bit earlier. When I was in college, I took a class called Drugs, Brain, and Behavior. And there I saw for the first time the serotonin molecule next to the LSD molecule. And it just kind of clicked that, oh my God, all of these drugs that cause these massive psychedelic effects are, mimicking endogenous neurotransmitters in the brain. And so they're sort of already in us, but they're messing with the receptor in a different way that causes a big change. And this to me was, a big shift away from, because I was at the time still, dabbling in philosophy, but really this was like, okay, physicalism, this is where we're going to get the big answers to consciousness.
It is true. When you look at the molecules of LSD and serotonin, they are close to identical, correct?
They have structural
for somebody who did not study that in college, but had a different approach to psychedelics. Well, not academically. I used, I should say, I used psychedelics when I was in college because I went to school in Chicago, and it was actually a very big distribution hub for both MDMA and LSD. The history of that is just insane. So there was a lot of this stuff around. And that was the beginning of my exploration of psychedelics, because I thought my mind is so small compared to what it could be, what's going out there in the world. So similar timing, but very different approaches there. So you got a lot of attention, especially in the world of neuroscience and beyond, for giving Octopuses MDMA. Let's talk about what inspired that. Tell us the story of you, Octopuses, and MDMA.
Well, okay, there's several different ways of telling that
I know.
story, but I'll tell you the one where, you know, where we get to what we understood about it. So basically, I had started my lab. We had already made the big discovery about MDMA reopening the critical period, which we'll get to in a bit, I assume.
Yes, definitely.
But I was having a really hard time convincing the NIH to fund our research, because every time I would say, you know, this is a big deal, this is something, they would be like, either it's not real, or nobody will ever use psychedelics clinically, or, you know, they're just bad for the brain. Like, no. And so I was something at like 17 tries at trying to get a single R01 and failed every time, and it was just brutal. And I was feeling pretty demoralized about, you know, my prospects as a scientist, because, you know, if you can't get NIH money, you know, it's really hard to keep the lab going and funding all of the researchers and the postdocs and the graduates.
Was the university supportive of it?
Yeah, so the university was really supportive, and you know, my department was especially supportive of it, because my department was started by somebody named Saul Snyder, who actually knew Sasha, and he was, I can tell you the legacy of Saul and how Sasha and Saul interacted as well. But my department was very supportive. I had private foundation money, but, you know, without the big NIH grants, it's really hard to imagine that you can have a future in academia. And so I was feeling demoralized, and I had just a little bit of money left over. And I was like, you know what? If I'm not going to make it, I want to do one last cool experiment before I go. And so I had already kind of gone down the rabbit hole of octopuses, because they're asocial, they're, you know, evolutionarily very distant. And I thought, you know, this would be a cool way to figure out what are the rules for building a complex brain. And a friend of mine who was at Woods Hole Marine Biological Laboratory emailed me, and he said, you know, we have 7 animals available. Do you have an experiment that you would want to try on them? And I was like, yes, I do. Send them down. And so he shipped them, he FedExed them down to my lab in Baltimore. And then he flew down, and I basically told everybody in my lab to go home. And we were going to take over the lab, and we did, because we didn't really have like an octopus setup. So we had to kind of make everybody go away so that they wouldn't get disturbed while we were doing the experiment. And we stayed up like all night and just did like mad science type of experiments. And what we did is we adapted a behavioral assay, a test that we used in mice already, to just assay how much, you know, animals like social interactions or not. We used a conservative version of the assay where, you know, what the other animal is under a flower pot, because octopuses are so asocial that under normal conditions they would murder each other.
They would murder each other.
Yeah. So
they would just attack each other?
They would attack each other and, you know, try and eat each other. They're very asocial. This species is a highly not the most asocial, and one of the more asocial, you know. But of the 300 or so known species of octopus, all but one are asocial.
So don't believe the movies.
Yeah, don't believe. If you want to hear me like explode, tell me how much you love my octopus teacher. Anyway, and so then we gave them MDMA, and you know, before we gave them the drug, they spent almost all of their time in the chamber that was furthest away from the other octopus, and then after MDMA, they spent most of their time in the chamber closest to the other octopus. But there were other things too that aren't really in the paper, which is, you know, we noticed that as soon as we hit the right dose, because we had to sort of empirically test the right dose, they got in the water and they just kind of spread their arms out and were just floating around and like sort of like a ballet dance, you know. And so we called it the ballerina dose. Yeah, it was such a robust behavior that even though we had a very small number of animals, we were able to get statistical significance, and you know, it sort of blew up.
Okay, so tell us why octopuses having the same response on MDMA that humans do is such an interesting thing.
Well, it's an interesting thing because at that time, there was a lot of enthusiasm in the field of psychedelics for anything fMRI imaging, right? So I would go to conferences and, people would say, whatever, what does a mouse seeing God look like anyway? You can't study any of the interesting parts of psychedelics in a mouse, right? That's just not interesting or important. And so we have to do everything in humans. And so because there's technical limitations and ethical limitations on what you can do in a human, all of those kinds of studies were basically fMRI brain imaging, which is a technique that I basically have very little faith in. It's essentially like trying to solve a traffic problem in New York City by taking pictures of cloud cover from Saturn. It just doesn't have the spatial or temporal resolution to give you any real answers.
Do you mean you can't see deeply into it?
Yeah,
it
so
shows you nice pictures.
So beautiful pictures, and so, you take LSD and, this part of your brain lights up and the connection between that part of your brain and that part of your brain, gets less, and people make all kinds of stories about default mode networks and, all of these, amygdala and anxiety and whatever. But what you're actually measuring is blood flow. Each voxel of an fMRI image is, at best, even if you have the strongest possible magnet, is about 100,000 neurons. Most of the time, it's about 1 million neurons. Some of them are excitatory, some of them are inhibitory. They can zero each other out. And we now know more recently, actually, that psychedelics change how the blood vessels work. And so the underlying assumption of fMRI imaging is that, you're correlating blood flow to neuronal activity. But that premise is actually totally changed with LSD and psilocybin because it changes the way the blood vessels actually flow.
What is more blood or less blood?
More blood, but it's not just more blood. It's like in different brain regions, it's different amounts. It changes the coupling and the oxygenation. It's a bunch of different assumptions that are suddenly violated. Anyway, so fMRI had problems with it, but more generally, there is this sort of assumption in neuroscience, and I'm somebody who does circuit neuroscience, so I do mapping of different brain regions, and I make claims like, the nucleus accumbens changed, or the amygdala changed, or the cortex changed, and I was embedded in that sort of assumption as well, that mechanism and anatomy are really very closely related. But an octopus doesn't have any of the brain regions that we have previously implicated in psychedelic function, right? So they don't have a cortex, so no default mode network. They don't have an amygdala. They don't have a hypothalamus. They don't have a nucleus accumbens, none of the brain regions. And yet, they're able to have the same behavioral response. And we think the reason for that is because when we looked at the species of octopus that we chose one whose genome had been resolved. And so we could look at the molecular level, and they have the same serotonin transporter that binds to MDMA in humans and in octopuses. And it has enough similarity in that binding pocket that it's able to recognize it. And then the anatomy that it plays out those molecular mechanisms on is just sort of secondary accidents of evolutionary history, but they're not the true core mechanism.
When you're looking at the change, you can actually see in a molecule the change that's happening with MDMA in the serotonin transporter?
So we haven't done that experiment yet. What we did, right now it's just sort of a correlation. So we have the genome, and we can look at the sequence of the serotonin transporter, and then we can calculate what the likely protein coding version of that would look like, and then we can compare the human versus the octopus versus the mouse, and we can look at each amino acid and say, okay, it's this much similar, and it's this much similar in this region, but more similar in this region. And so it turns out overall the serotonin transporter is only about 60% similar, but in the serotonin binding pocket and in the binding pocket where MDMA normally sits, it's 100% conserved. And so that means, that gives us a sort of handle. But to formally prove the point that you're talking about, we want to do a bunch of pharmacology. We want to block it. We want to knock it out. We want to make sure that that is the way that it's happening in octopuses. So that's what we're working on now.
So when we started this, you said you were working in critical periods, and then we'll talk about rats. But so tell us what a critical period is. Tell us all.
Okay.
Because it's really fascinating.
So critical periods are, well, they were first described by Konrad Lorenz, who was describing imprinting behavior in gray-lag geese. And so this is that behavior where the little chick will form a lifelong attachment to whatever is moving around in their environment in that first 48 hours after hatching. And normally that would be their mom, but if the mom isn't available, it'll be any other moving object in their vicinity. And he described this in 1935. And because there's this very small window of time, that 48 hours right after hatching, where they have to receive this exposure for them to form that memory, he called that window a critical period. And since that time, we've discovered dozens of other critical periods for everything from language to visual input processing to motor movements to emotions. And critical periods basically govern every single learned behavior, from like personality to being able to see, right? And so neuroscientists have been obsessed with critical periods since their first discovery. There's about 7,000 papers looking at critical period mechanisms. 3 Nobel Prizes have been given. And the idea is that we need to understand the mechanisms, because neuroscientists understand that the reason we're so bad at treating diseases of the brain, like, stroke or language impairments, psychiatric illnesses, is because by the time we get around to intervening, the relevant critical period is already closed. And so the classic example of this is if you are born with cataracts in both eyes, and then you don't have them removed by the time you're about 5 years old, then even if you remove them, you will be blind forever, because the critical period for the visual system to reorganize and be able to interpret information coming in through the eyes is closed, okay? And so the dream has been reopen the critical period in adulthood, and all those people who missed out or were blind, you could teach them to interpret their visual information again, right? So this is how powerful the idea was. And I got to tell you, when I was a graduate student, there was another lab at Harvard that was arguing that they wanted to find the master keys for unlocking critical periods. And I just kind of laughed it off, because I was like, that is, anything that could do that to the brain is either going to cause massive amnesia, massive seizure, or going to cause like a destruction of the structural integrity of
like
the
a
brain.
Meltdown of the brain. Yeah, okay.
And so I just kind of poo-pooed the whole idea. And then 20 years later, we discovered a new critical period, a critical period for social behaviors. And we think this is the critical period why, children or teenagers are so much more susceptible to peer pressure, why, you understand the rules of social engagement of the culture you grew up in, but maybe feel like a little out of place when you go to a different culture. And we think it's also why, things like people who have really bad PTSD or adverse childhood experiences when they're young, that has a much more lasting impact in adulthood, because there's that critical period for social learning. So we were studying that, and we were interested in it anyway. And when I started talking about it, people were like, that's not a real critical period. It's just emotions. Real critical periods are all about vision and motor and touch and physical. Like sensory critical periods. That's what people kept saying. And I was like, no, the first critical period was a social one, and it didn't matter. And I realized that I wasn't really going to be able to convince people unless I could show the mechanisms and then find a way that could reopen the critical period. So we started looking, and of course, I knew about Sasha's work, and I knew about, the MDMA, and I knew what MAPS was doing with the clinical trials for PTSD. And I said, wouldn't it be amazing if MDMA reopens this critical period?
And did the octopus, was that like boing when that happened, when the octopuses started being friendly? Did you have the critical period idea at that moment when you saw it?
No. So the critical period idea, those are all experiments we were doing in mice.
Gotcha.
So we already had discovered that MDMA opened the critical period in mice.
Right.
And I just couldn't get funding to do more of that kind of research. Like I've saved the emails from program officers who told me MDMA will never be used in humans for any real disease, right? Like that's just, and I have program officers and, reviewers who were saying this will never happen. My friend Roland Griffiths, who, was not in my same department, but he was also at Johns Hopkins. I asked him about it. I was like crying in his office, like, I can't get funding. and he was like, well, you're doing it wrong. You can't propose to the NIH that you're going to study something good about psychedelics. You have to propose it like, I'm studying, the potential harmful effects of psychedelics. And, and accidentally, look at this amazing thing that I found. And I was kind of stubborn, and I was like, kind of stubborn. And I was just like, no, Roland, I can't do that. If this is true, what I'm saying about critical periods in psychedelics, like, this is a really big deal. I want to get credit for having known this thing. I'm not going to bastardize my idea and flip it upside down for NIH funding. But Roland was right. I suffered for a really long time over it. And it wasn't until after that paper was accepted into, one of the best journals, Nature, that I got funding to do the experiments that were already in the paper that was published. So sort of backwards, but anyway, that's how it happens.
Talk about the work with mice then also.
Yeah,
this is also another layer to this complicated
history. Yeah. So the mouse stuff, originally, when we did that experiment, we thought, okay, MDMA is different from other psychedelics in that it has this very unique pro-social profile, right? So people take MDMA and they go to raves and they, do these 30-person cuddle puddles, right? Like people aren't doing 30-person cuddle puddles on LSD, it depends on
ayahuasca.
Ayahuasca.
You're not cuddling.
Not ibogaine for sure.
Certainly not ibogaine.
No, nobody's cuddling like that. And so MDMA has this like unique pro-social profile. And so we originally thought that MDMA would reopen this critical period because of the pro-social profile. But we got one little hint in that first paper that maybe that way of thinking about it wasn't right, which is that we know from all of the psychonauts and all of the clinical work that the context really matters, right? So this is what Timothy Leary was calling the set and setting dependence, the mindset and the situational setting that also matters, not just for the trip, but also for the therapy and for the clinical experience. And so, what I always say is you can't take MDMA and go to a rave and necessarily expect that you're going to cure your PTSD, right? And so you need that right context. And so in order to look at that, we wondered, is the opening of this critical period with MDMA context dependent? And it is. And so if we gave MDMA in a social context, then we were able to reopen the social critical period. But when we gave it in an isolation context, we didn't, right? So that means that in the isolation context, even though the MDMA has some pro-social effect all by itself, it's not enough to open the social critical period. So we did another experiment just to compare. So we looked across a bunch of different drugs. First, we wanted to look at cocaine because cocaine is also, related stimulant drug, but it's not a psychedelic. It doesn't have the same therapeutic profile. It has abuse liability. It has all kinds of other things that are different from MDMA. And when we but we were worried, like maybe we're just giving them these drugs that they like doing. They're having a sort of mouse party and they're, realizing how fun it is to be social. And that's all it is. It's not really a critical period reopening. It's just remembering how fun it is to go to a mouse rave. And that wasn't the case, right? Because cocaine didn't do it. And mice love cocaine. I mean, they really love cocaine. So if you inject them with cocaine a bunch of times in a row, like they start like coming up to the cage and they're like, yeah, I'm ready.
Give us more.
Ready. So they love cocaine, but it did not reopen this critical period. But then we also wanted to test the other psychedelics. So we were like, well, what about LSD and ketamine and ibogaine and psilocybin? Do they reopen this critical period? And they did. And so that was a big, all of them did it. And, you know, when we first got the LSD experiments, I was such a skeptic, and my poor postdoc, Roman, because he came, you know, he's totally straight edge. He's never done a psychedelic in his life. He's like the most nerdy angel in the lab, you know, and he showed me this result, and I was like, no, that's not true. That doesn't fit with our story. Like, do it again. And he did it again, and then we had some other people do it, and then, you know, we just many, many times to convince me. But anyway, he convinced me, and it was true. And then we started looking at all of them. So that was interesting because it said it's not the prosocial property that matters, it's the psychedelic that matters, because non-psychedelics don't do it, but all of the psychedelics, whether they're prosocial or not, do. And so this was interesting to us because what it suggested is that the unifying similarity across psychedelics was this ability to reopen this critical period. And suddenly, it started to give us an explanation for why psychedelics were having such broad therapeutic effects, right? So like people were, like Michael Pollan, for example, was like, yeah, when people started making all these claims like, oh, it cures this disease, it cures that disease, it's, you know, that maybe this is just, you know, apocryphal because people are wishful thinking, there's just so much enthusiasm behind psychedelics. How could one class of drugs be effective for diseases that are as different as, you know, PTSD and depression and, you know, addiction, right? And so, you know, they look different in some ways, right? And so people were not sure how to explain that. And at the same time, like at Johns Hopkins, I remember there was a big push for, oh, every psychedelic has its own best disease, right? So Hopkins was focused on psilocybin for addiction or depression, but MDMA for PTSD. And they thought, well, psilocybin will never work for PTSD and MDMA will never work for addiction. And now we're finding out that that's not true.
It was completely confounding to me when I started researching this book. It was like, wait, they're all saying the same thing.
Right.
What's going on here?
Yeah. And a lot of people at the time were locked into what I will call the biochemical imbalance model of disease, right? So when psychedelics first started getting traction in the sort of clinical literature, people said, oh, well, they're working because they're essentially just next generation SSRIs, right? So they are structurally similar to serotonin. The biochemical imbalance model that's been around since the 50s and 60s is basically that, you know, depression is just a biochemical imbalance in serotonin. And if you want to fix depression, you just have to rebalance serotonin levels and it's all good. And psychedelics are essentially just a new version of that. What our results are suggesting is that, no, that's not quite right. And that instead, what psychedelics are doing is they're restoring the ability to learn. And it's sort of the learning model instead of the biochemical imbalance model. And this is why it's effective for so many diseases and why psychedelics that have nothing to do with the serotonin 2A receptor or the serotonin transporter like ibogaine and ketamine are also working and seem to be sharing many of these clinical properties. So this was like a big breakthrough that the similarity across psychedelics wasn't just about the receptor. It was something else that's happening that's common to all of them, and they're all getting to that place through various different routes.
And what's common to all of them is tripping.
Is tripping.
And
then critical period reopening. So this is the other main insight of the more recent paper, is that we found, so psychedelics differ in a lot of different ways. One of the ways that they differ is the duration of the trip, right? So ketamine has a 30-minute to 2-hour trip. Ibogaine is, 36 to 72 hours, right? So it's a pretty big spectrum.
It's a long experience.
It's a long trip. MDMA and psilocybin are sort of in the middle. LSD is a little bit longer. And what we found is that there is a proportionality between the duration of the trip and the duration of the critical period open state. So the longer the trip, the longer the critical period stays open after the trip is over. So for ibogaine, that's at least a month after the trip, right? And so this suddenly has two implications. One, it says mechanistically, the trip and how long this window of opportunity for you to learn from that trip and to really lock in those insights into your daily habits of behavior, those things are related to each other, and we don't know what the mechanism is, but they're related. It must be related. The other insight is that it suggests that this is why the clinicians emphasize so much the integration phase and the importance of the sort of setting the intention and then working on the habits and on all the other insights that you had, locking them in. And that this is why ibogaine, for example, is so impressive in its ability to help people with heroin addiction, because heroin addiction is essentially a very entrenched memory that kind of bleeds into all aspects of your life. It's really entrenched. And so if you're going to change all of the memories you've built around all of those habits of thought and behavior, you're going to try and undo and relearn. It's useful to have the longest period possible afterwards to relearn those things.
Yeah. So anybody here know what ibogaine, does not know what ibogaine is? Yeah. Ibogaine comes from a plant in West Africa called Tabernanthe boga, and it's the root of this plant. And it's been used ceremonially, thank you, for, they say, thousands of years. And it's used as an initiation, usually into adulthood. And they'll take it and they'll have these very long ceremonies that can go on for days, sometimes 5-6 days. And it really inculcates the entire worldview of the tribe into the initiates. It's very interesting. And I just interviewed the folks from Beyond, which has a clinic in Mexico, and they've been doing ibogaine treatment. It's very luxe. It's like first class, very beautiful, right? And they spend a lot of time after the journey with people. And sometimes they say you have to come back and do it again. Some people, it's not a miracle. It doesn't happen all the time in one dose. Why is it that you would have to come back again? Is it because those habits are so ingrained in the brain?
Yeah. So I think it's, so I went down to Beyond in February, and I met a lot of these veterans who were having these experiences. And, you know, first of all, a lot of them came in already with the idea based on, you know, TV and, you know, podcasts, and just that this was a miracle pill and they were going to come in and take, and it was going to be over. And there were a couple of people who had come for the second or third time, and, you know, they were kind of disappointed in themselves. They were like, "Oh, I knew I was the rotten apple, that this wasn't going to work
really?
for," right? And I said, "No, now you're not the same person that you were the first time that you came. This is not, it's like anything else that you learn. Nobody learns how to ride a bike in one day. Nobody learns a language in 1 week, right? So you have to practice, it's a continual learning process. And when you think about how long the critical period, let's say for language learning, stays open so that you can learn a language, it's, 6-7 years, right? And so, and that's like really open, and you've got everybody helping you because they're talking baby talk at you and making things simple and correcting you in a gentle way, right? So you've got a whole support network of integration around learning a language. And I think that, as we sort of get a better handle on this mechanistic insight about critical periods, my dream is that we provide people with a lot more support after the trip, where we're essentially treating them like this, you're in this state of, openness and vulnerability and sensitivity. We need to be providing you with everything you need to relearn the world according to the new circumstances that you find yourself in, and not sort of just throw you back into whatever was traumatizing you or whatever set of stressors that were making it difficult for you to learn your habits. But also, sometimes you just need to learn a new lesson this time, right? And so maybe the first time you learned the sort of root cause of it, and the second time you learned all of the different ways that you sort of fall back on that set of habits when you get stressed out, and so I think that that's why it takes
The
longer.
thing that always fascinates me about ibogaine is many people have described it as almost seeing a slideshow of your life, like you're seeing difficult moments of your life. Yeah, I think you can see it with a fair amount of equanimity. You can absorb it and understand it, but that it also points away. I keep hearing this, that it points away forward.
Mm.
And I can't understand if that's like like a hidden memory, like daddy told me to do it this way, or where that comes from. Do you have any thought about that?
I mean, I don't know. The thing about the ibogaine trips is that you tend to hear about the ones that are the most sort of colorful. So a lot of the veterans will say stuff like, "Oh yeah, it was like a slideshow of like all the worst things in my life." And another veteran I talked to said he had a time dilation of 90 years and he left the next day. He was like, "That's enough. Like it was too much."
Oh my
And
God.
but then there are other people who talk about it very much like, "Oh, it was gentle teacher, and I was able to very much engage with it like a lucid dream and cognitively sort of ask for, oh, I wanted to see this or I wanted to resolve this." And then the slideshow would just provide just the memory that they needed to resolve that issue, right? So, my working hypothesis about it right now is that a lot of this is working on the dreaming pathways and the I mean, we're interested in trying to figure out the neural circuitry of, dreaming that might be related to ibogaine, because ibogaine is an onirogenic psychedelic, meaning it
There's the name.
induces this sleep or dreamlike state. And I think that, that's potentially interesting. And mechanistically, it interacts with VMAT2, which is especially highly expressed in noradrenergic cells of the brainstem that are important for regulating sleep and wake cycles. So possibly, although that seems to me probably an oversimplistic explanation, but it's a place to start. So yeah, it's exciting
Very
and
interesting.
interesting.
Stepping just away from medicine for a second, how does the idea of preparation and integration, how can people who are using psychedelics, not medically, for example, for inspiration or for creativity or just to sort of whatever people use psychedelics for, whatever we use them for, what kind of preparation and integration can they do? And I don't even mean with a therapist. I mean people on their own. How can you actually prime the brain how can you direct the brain? Can we really do it?
Yes. And I think that, I'll just give an anecdote. I think that what you ingest intellectually in the weeks to months before you do a psychedelic is probably going to show up in some way or another during your trip. So I will just anecdotally, if you read a book that's, all about psychedelics and talking about, Freudian this and Jungian that, and, you get this like idea about, women are the void, you might come up in your journey that you are this, and you have this like very old fashioned view of, masculinity and femininity, and it could have a big impact on you. And you might be careful about what it is that you ingest intellectually before you take the psychedelic, because it can come up.
I'm thinking this is weeks before you take the
Weeks,
psychedelic, though.
months even.
Yeah.
And so I think that my intuition about people who had the sort of nightmare roller coaster type of ibogaine journey versus the people who had gentle teacher are really, I mean, this is just anecdotal. I haven't done a survey of this or anything. Is the amount of preparation that people did, right? And so, people who showed up at the clinic and who were like, "Yesterday I had a gun in my mouth. When this doesn't work, tomorrow I'm going home to kill myself," right? Those are the people who had the nightmare roller coaster. The people who had just as horrific of a trauma, like imagine the worst kind of incest trauma you can imagine. They can still have a gentle teacher if they've spent years sort of preparing and working on it and thinking about what it is that they wanted to achieve with the journey.
You're talking mostly intellectual things, reading, thinking. Are there visual, is music, are other sort of things, inputs, basically, that we have. Do you think they could be effective at the preparation stage?
Maybe. I'm not sure. I mean, what I think is that in some ways, psychedelics, the emotional content of what you come in with, I could certainly imagine that, right? If you're under a lot of stress, if you're feeling very closed off, if all of those things, those are going to impact what you're likely to experience during the psychedelic. In terms of art and music and going for a walk in the forest, I think is always probably a nice way to inspire that. But I'm not basing this at all on data. I'm just intuitively think that one of the critical periods that we haven't discovered yet, but I suspect exists, is a critical period for play behavior, right? So I think that there is a relationship between play and art, and essentially what psychedelics are doing is restoring that youthful play-like self where you're solving problems the way that a child does. And Alison Gopnik, who's a faculty at, she's emeritus at Berkeley, she's actually done a lot of work on child developmental psychology, and she's shown different problems that children are able to solve that adults can't solve.
Like what?
And I can't remember the details of it. It's like these special block configurations where an adult is like, well, it has to go like this, and a child is like, why can't it be like this? And so they just solve the problem because they're not so much constrained by causal relationships the way that we are. We've learned, the causal relationship through trial and error. We know about gravity. We know about, that elves don't exist and unicorns don't exist. We've got all of these causal rules of our life, and it constrains how we solve problems. But children are much more likely to believe in Santa and can solve these kinds of weird problems. And so I do think that somehow psychedelics are restoring us to that, getting rid of our rules of causality in some ways, which is why I also think that a lot of people come out of a psychedelic and, will suddenly switch to a more sort of, let's say, a change in their metaphysics about, what, whether or not they believe in, things that are non-physical, right? And so and I'm not saying one way or the other is right. It's just that I think that this restoration of this play-like state, of this juvenile state of engaging in a playful way is a thing. And I suspect that the reason that we like art and music and dance so much is because those are a way to play as adults, right? It's just a little bit of play that we allow ourselves to have in adulthood. And psychedelics really bring that back in a big way. And that's why I think octopuses like to dance on psychedelics and humans like to dance on psychedelics. And after you've done psychedelics, you get more interested in, dancing and art and
things of the spirit as well. I mean, so it always struck me when reading about Sasha Shulgin that he was a very playful adult and that he had a very good sense of humor. True?
I mean, as far as I know, I didn't know him well enough to.
It's true, right? You knew him, right? Yeah. Very interesting. I mean, even as he grew old, and had difficulty seeing and things like this, he was supposed to be very fun, very patient. So, inshallah, that could happen to us all, right? Let's talk about. So, I was just in Oregon, and they have a very interesting model of psychedelics. It's not tied to the medical model. Anybody can go into a clinic once you do your screenings, and you can take a journey. It's psilocybin, and it costs, depending on what you're doing, it can cost between $500 and $2,000, depending on the number of hours of prep and integration. And I think that's quite freeing. I think that's quite liberating. You don't have to be diagnosed with a condition, right? And I think that's one of the interesting models that are being proposed. And I'm hoping, my gut is, what I would love to do is see different states, if we remain a country, adopt different models that they can go for like 10 years, and then we examine, okay, what is the effects of this? What is the effectiveness of how this all works out? Do you have any thoughts about how psychedelics can be used? Well, I know we know about medically, but beyond the medical model. Do you have any thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, I have some concerns about the way things are going right now. One is that I am very concerned about how the pharmaceutical companies are rushing to turn these drugs into next generation SSRIs. And one of the things that they want to do is get rid of the therapy. They don't want to reimburse the therapy. They want to just create a safe, democratized, these are the words that they love to trick people into thinking what they're doing is actually not for a profit motive, right? And they essentially want to be able to send people home with a pill and then get them to have to take that pill once a week or every day, ideally, right? And they can prescribe it and you can order it on Amazon and you never have to do the learning part of it. And I worry that if we don't take seriously this mechanistic insight that these are not just next generation SSRIs, that we're going to have a lot of people, because we're so conditioned to that. It's not just the pharmaceutical companies, all of us are conditioned to the idea that if it didn't work, I just need to take more. I just need to take it again, and I need to do it over and over and over again. And, I worry that also culturally, if you have, I have a sad story of a friend of mine who committed suicide, and she was a neuroscientist, and she had taken MDMA, discovered that she had some very serious trauma history, and just wanted to go in there and clean it up and deal with it and fix it as soon as possible. So she just kept going in without giving herself enough time between doses to really integrate, to really have, and she was living, in Portugal, where they had a lot, sort of more readily available healthcare assistance, and the feelings that just came up were so bad. She just wanted to get rid of them quickly, right? And so I do worry that if we don't really teach everybody, and especially clinicians, that this isn't a magic pill. This is learning. This takes time. You need to give yourself the time between doses to integrate, to learn the lessons you need to learn, and to support people while they're doing that. Just doing the Oregon model, yes, there's going to be a lot of people that are going to benefit immediately from that, but there's also potentially all of this stuff that happens when we don't do it right. And
you're talking about, though, an overhaul in cultural education. I mean, you're talking about an entirely different approach to psychedelics, are you not?
Yeah.
I mean, because in this, what we learned, my age, we just learned about the trip, right? And that's what we did.
Well,
and now we have to hold, if this is all happening now, the idea that these are not one and done, that these are maybe month-long experiences where the trip comes in the middle, say, right, or at some point.
Yep.
It's quite, that's a big cultural shift, isn't it?
It is, but I think that as much as I would like to take credit for all of this insight all by myself, it's not true. Like Timothy Leary
was very, yeah.
He kept saying, psychedelics help you. I'm going to make you take psychedelics and imprint all of you, right? Like, what is imprinting but reopening the critical period, right? That's the same. It's just a different, and there's no way he wasn't aware of, Conrad Lorenz's work when he started talking that way. It was the psychonauts who emphasized the importance of the set and settings. These are all things that we knew, but in the rush to kind of medicalize them using the biochemical imbalance model, we seem to have forgotten. So I don't think it's like a radical rethinking. And frankly, if we're going to get people to radically rethink things, psychedelics are a wonderful way.
Frankly. Maybe the water was not the worst idea.
But I am nervous because, I know that there's a lot of excitement around psychedelics and a lot of hype around psychedelics. And when I go down to a place like Beyond and meet the people who have heard about it from, podcasts or, the news or, and they already come in with this idea of the magic pill, makes me nervous that we have a lot more education to do before we.
It's one of the problems with prohibition. It didn't really stop use, but it really stopped research and education, right?
Right.
So, I mean, that's one of the major problems, I think. And I don't know how I mean, everybody, I mean, the other night, someone came up to me and said, I did a talk, and he said, I'm going to take ecstasy this weekend. And I said, oh, good, what's ecstasy? And he said, well, it's MDMA with something in it. And I said, what's the something? And he said, I don't know. And I said, well, you may want to think about that also. I mean, it really goes across the culture here, right? It's like, I also thought, are you a vegan who's like expecting everything you put in your mouth except for the pill? So, I mean, it also brings up the question of who does control these substances. And I worry about this. I think I lose sleep over it. And part of me thinks, the underground has done a pretty good job. And maybe that's the way it should just stay, because right now, do we want the government controlling this stuff? Do we want the medical profession? The pharmaceutical industry, which is tied into the medical profession? It's really a knotty problem, isn't it?
Yep.
How do you think about it?
Well, I think the cautionary tale is cannabis, actually. So, I think that there was so much of a push to legalize cannabis, and I was part of the Cannabis Action Network.
Me too.
Really thought that this was racist policy and we needed to change it. But I look now and I talk to my friends who are in emergency room doctors and people who are in psychiatry, and the way that it's kind of exploded, and cannabis is so potent now.
Crazy.
The amount of
Yeah.
psychosis
Yeah.
people are seeing in the clinical setting, it's like through the roof, and so it'll probably eventually slow down, but for now it's just every company who had been waiting to patent their super potent genetic variant of THC, is marketing, and it's scary. Like, it's no longer the same drug that we all
No, it's no
campaigned
fun
on,
anymore.
right?
It's like it's sort of a nightmare.
Well, and you drive around Oakland and you stop at any old stop sign and you can get high just from the window open, because people are just everywhere smoking. It's like, dude, you're not supposed to drive with this stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. But let's talk about, all right.
And so back to psychedelics, though, I would just say that sometimes the history matters, right? So after this many years of having them being, said they were bad for you, that they do all these things, which many of those things that they said were not true. Nevertheless, the second that gets lifted, a lot of people are just going to assume, oh, these are totally safe. I can do them whatever. I can, I know people who are like, oh, they read the hype around it, and they're like, they want to go. They're like, I'm tough. I'm a party animal, and then they do a massive amount of psychedelics that they're totally unprepared for, and they're taking the sort of the frat boy attitude towards it instead of the sort of thoughtful, this is a mystical, powerful, this is something that I have deep respect for as something that can change my whole life and my brain, right?
Our culture is not good at that. We are not good at sacrament, and we're not good at ritual.
Right.
And it would be a good thing for us to learn.
I think it would. I mean, but
No, it's a whole attitudinal shift. Yeah.
You got an idea? Let's talk. We could probably raise some money for that one. Just kidding. Let's talk about the mystical thing just for a minute, because it's really interesting, and I don't know how it ties into critical period. And I don't think you and I have ever spoken about this, but a lot of people have a, quote, mystical experience. They understand that they're unitary consciousness, that they are one with that tree out there. We are not different. This difference between self and other disappears. There's a sense of knowing that this is somehow beyond words true, right? Mm-hmm. This is what the MEQ says anyway. Mm-hmm. And it's actually sort of an interesting, it's called the Mystical Experience Questionnaire that was originally stated by William James, I think. And now if you're ever in a clinical trial, you'll be spending your life filling out MEQs.
Not if you're in my trial.
Where does and there's so much evidence that, these things do, many of them, many psychedelics, certainly not all, do instigate a mystical experience. How do you think about that? Go on.
I actually,
feel free.
All right. Well, I mean, I will say, I actually think that the critical period explanation works there too.
Really?
Yes, because for decades before we discovered this psychedelics business, the best way to reopen a critical period was through deprivation, right? So if you put somebody in total darkness for 2 weeks, can reopen their visual critical period. But it was just not a very clinically useful application, right? Like, who wants to go into solitary confinement for a month in order to, treat their PTSD? It's just not very, practical. But religious practices have been using deprivation forever to get to these mystical states, right? So you live in a cave for a month, or you go on a silent retreat, or you move to a monastery or an ashram. And this radical shift in your environment, we think, is in the statistics of what you normally expect, is reopening critical periods. And we know from the few human studies that have done blindfolding visual deprivation to reopen the visual critical period, they all report mystical experiences and hallucinations. Yep. And so I think that what it feels like to be in that altered state of consciousness that's similar between these mystical experiences and similar between psychedelics is just what it feels like to reopen critical periods. And the Zen Buddhists say one of the things they're trying to achieve when they get to these mystical states is beginner's mind. If you were looking for a neurobiological description of beginner's mind, reopening critical periods is it. And so mechanistically, there's also similarities when you get down to metaplasticity and extracellular matrix remodeling and all the other things that we didn't talk about that we think are the biology underlying all this. All that stuff is overlapping too. So I actually do think that this critical period explanation gives us a handle to really start asking those consciousness questions that I originally started out being curious
What interests
about.
me too, though, in some of the studies, you read about people who are atheist or agnostic, have had no religious training, and yet they have these mystical experiences. They somehow understand, whatever you want to call God, right? And that really fascinates me. It's like, okay, you have none of it. Where does it come from? Is it imbued? Is it really part of us?
Well,
metaphysically. Well, more than metaphysically, physically.
Well, that part I'm not going to be able to have a answer about. What I'll say is that not everybody sees God. Certainly some people see. So I was talking to a friend of mine who's a mathematician, and I was explaining about, this thing that people see where, they lose the boundary between themselves and, say, a chair. And Aldous Huxley has a great chair description. And the me molecules and the chair molecules, as you get further and further away from me, the number of me molecules, goes away, but not to zero. It never gets to zero. And the chair molecules, and so at some point, the me molecules and the chair molecules are interconnected, and we are one. And I explained this to my mathematician friend, and she was like, "Yeah, there's like a whole field of mathematics called asymptotics that describes that exact phenomenon."
Oh, really?
Right? And so, I'm not really necessarily convinced that a mystical experience has to be a non-physicalist experience. Okay. Nevertheless, it can be mystical, and I do think that we are a social species, and that religion and morality are sort of advanced social behaviors in some ways. It's a way of organizing the rules that govern good behavior within our society, and that's not my idea. That's Donald Broom has a beautiful book about the evolution of morality and religion. And so, I do
So it's baked in somewhere, whether you believe or not. I mean, of course, we are all, yeah. Let's talk about the money shot. So you've tested this in rats, and you've tested it in, or mice, and you've tested it in octopuses. What is your next, how are you going to do this in humans?
Yeah, so one of the insights about the critical period is that critical periods don't just govern things that are important for psychiatry. They also govern things for neurology, and also, and I have this newer theory about allergy and immunology. And so if we can reopen critical periods, like And all we have to do to reopen different critical periods is just change the context. If we want to reopen a critical period for motor learning after stroke, we just switch from a social context to a motor context. And we've started doing that in mice, but we're getting really close. Hopefully before the end of the year, we'll have our first patient starting our human clinical trial in patients who've had a stroke more than a year ago. So their critical period for motor learning closes after about 2 months after the stroke. So we want to reopen it and test whether or not we can pair that with physical therapy and get them to after. Right.
I'm going to sign up for that study.
Okay.
Where is it?
I will put you in touch with our study coordinator. Yeah, we have, no, I'm happy to take, and if you know anybody, please email me or look on our website. We have a, we're starting to get a wait list, but we're going to be doing this for a while, we think. And so, yeah, definitely.
Where's it happening? In Berkeley?
So that's at Johns Hopkins still. I still have an adjunct appointment at Johns Hopkins to do that because we started it there. And I have this incredible team of neurologists, and they've designed this amazing dolphin virtual reality video game to assist with the physical therapy. So I have a version of it in my office to demonstrate, but basically when you move your arm around, it tracks your arm and it moves this dolphin around the screen, and you have to like use your arm to try and catch fish, and it has like 500 levels. I've only made it to level 5. But some of these patients make it all the way to level 500. It's very fun and engaging to catch these fish, and it's hard because it's a 3-dimensional thing, and so you have to learn how to navigate the arm, and you sort of have to have the dolphin become your avatar in a way, and so you have to really get into it. Anyway, so we'll be giving people that the day before. Then during the trip, they'll have access to it, but they don't have to play if they don't want to. And we're giving them very high psilocybin. Yeah,
How
very high. So 25 milligrams, so, a hero dose. And then the following day, they come back in, and then they have 3 weeks of intensive, 3 times a day dolphin game, to really kind of get that learning to be maximized during that open state of the critical period. So that's one thing. But I have another, I know there are anecdotal reports of people saying that they can cure their allergies with psychedelics. My mother she's retired now, an allergy and immunologist. And when I told her, I think there's a critical period for learning what things to be allergic to, and that we could reopen them, she just laughed at me. And she's like, that's stupid. Like, that's not how the immune system works. Right. And I was like, I don't know. I think this could be interesting. And then I told her about an anecdote, and this was like 2 weeks ago. I told her this anecdote of somebody whose dog allergies have gone away with psychedelics, and somebody she knows. And she was like, well, maybe it is critical period. So I'm suddenly hopeful that I'm going to convince my mom. That's really the end goal of all of this, is to convince my mom that I'm an adult.
Remember, Andrew Weil wrote that in the 1970s. Had a cat allergy. He was tripping one day on LSD. The cat jumped on his lap. No sneezing, no hives, no rash, and he never had an allergy to cats again.
Yeah, I think that, again, the learning idea holds, though. It's sort of like you have to pair the psychedelic with the cat context or the dog context or whatever, and you have to unlearn that this causes my immune system to react. Pairing
That's
that
so
your brain
amazing.
That's what I think.
That is amazing. That is the next frontier of mind, certainly, isn't it?
Yeah, I think we should try it on all those people who got peanut allergies because we didn't, because they're having really a hard time having any therapeutic efficacy of the sort of shots or the sublingual dosing of peanuts to recover from. But if we paired it with psychedelics, I wouldn't do it without an EpiPen. It's just a theory. But I think it's worth doing a trial on it.
Ben, you have a question?
Yeah, I have a question. So
loudly, please.
Yeah. So I've heard some things about how there's a big focus on the brain as the focus. There's a big focus on the brain for where neurons are and serotonin and everything. But I've also heard a large portion of serotonin is produced in the gut,
Yep.
and that there's neurons in the gut, and
Yep.
the first organisms were basically just guts, and they evolved over time, and we have like this symbiosis with different fungi and bacteria. So I'm curious about if there's any research on how that relationship plays out in other neurons that are not in the brain.
Yeah, I'm not doing that research, but I gave this talk at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory a couple years ago now, and somebody who works on the relationship between the gut microbiome and cancer, actually. He heard this talk and he was like, oh, we don't call it a critical period, but the same thing is true for the gut microbiome, in that if you want to, reset it so that you have populated in your microbiome the type of bacteria that protect you against getting cancer, it's really hard to do. You have to essentially put somebody on IV antibiotics for weeks. You have to give them enemas. You have to really clear out all the bacteria. You have to kill everything that's left over in the appendix. And even then, after a certain age, it's hard to get the healthy bacteria populating, which is why probably, and there's suggestions that it's not just the biome effects like your susceptibility to cancer, but also there's some evidence that it affects your mood, it affects, all kinds of other things, your weight, all of these things. And so I can certainly imagine that kind of thing happening with psychedelics. I will also say it's not just the gut. There are a ton of NMDA receptors in the skin, which is how ketamine works. And I can imagine sort of as we think in the future, I was just telling Paul this yesterday, there are some people who aren't able to really get a lot of benefit from serotonin psychedelics because they're not making enough serotonin. So I'm thinking of people like vegans or anorexics that they give them psychedelics and they get no response, right? And it's probably because they're just not making enough serotonin. Their transporters, their whole gut is all screwed up in ability to import the essential amino acids necessary to make those neurotransmitters. But they do respond, those same people will respond well to ketamine because they, it seems like there's one clinical trial in Europe somewhere showing that ketamine works so much better for people with anorexia because it's working through a non-serotonergic system. So I think it's important to think about the whole body, but also use cases that might be appropriate for different psychedelics.
Let me ask you one more question, and then we'll take your questions. What are the 3 most interesting books you've read on psychedelics? And I know that's hard because 3 is a very small number, but and there's so many. And it could even be consciousness in psychedelics. It doesn't have to be limited to psychedelics, certainly.
Well, gosh,
it's hard.
That's hard. In my class, I'm teaching psychedelics to undergrads at Berkeley, and in honor of Sasha and commemorating Sasha's, would have been his 100th birthday, as our class project, we are taking PCAL and TCAL, every single molecule that's in there, and their class project is to make molecular models of those molecules, and then we're going to come to the farm. Wendy has generously invited us to come, and so we'll come here and we'll hang those molecules. And
Demo day.
You'll
have a demo day.
Yeah, and the students are just enjoying so much being able to read the chemistry, read the descriptions, get really into the history of it. I think it's something that makes, it's really special to be able to teach psychedelics at Berkeley because that's where Sasha was, and this is so close here, and it really, I think it connects us to the legacy of this whole movement in such a big way. And so obviously those 2. And
well, go on.
And then the third one I would say is, it's not really about psychedelics, but the last chapter has a really interesting insight about psychedelics. It's called The Dawn of Everything by David Graeber. And it's a book. It's massive. It's like PCAL, very big. I like, if I'm going to invest to get into reading a book, I like for that investment to
You need
last for a
900
while.
pages?
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. I hate investing and then it's over, and then I have to start all over in the investment process again. So anyway, I like long books. Dawn of Everything is very satisfying in that way. And it's essentially an anthropologist and an archaeologist who are taking a lot of the assumptions that we had about civilizations, and how he sort of takes down old ideas about where the Enlightenment ideas come from. Turns out they come from Native Americans. And in the last chapters, he's sort of talking about how our kinds of civilizations that are, patriarchal, very warlike, very poor at taking care of their environment, they tend to, and hierarchical, they tend to last about 2,000 years.
Oh,
and there's a lot of hallmarks of those civilizations that when they're about to end, and we're kind of
We're there.
we're there. We're maybe like another 100 years, but we're close. And then there are these civilizations that have been widely ignored by archaeology and anthropology. And actually, some of them weren't ignored, they were just recently discovered. Hunter-gatherers that nevertheless have massive cultural sites and probably some religious, mystical practices. And there's even evidence that, some of these are matriarchal theocracies surrounding psychedelic cults. Like there's one in Peru and one in Crete, and that these civilizations tend to last a lot longer, and they've just been understudied. And so it's a really interesting book that brings together some of my favorite ideas that women are taking over,
Yes,
and
we need
psychedelics
mother.
are taking over, and that we're gonna, have a longer lasting peaceful civilization.
Again, inshallah, I hope it happens. So we have some time for questions, and then Wendy, we're going to do a tour, right? Or groups of tours. So do any of you have a question or a comment? I'll just bring a mic to you.
First of all, thank you for this wonderful conversation. So in animals, the acute effects of psychedelics are fairly shorter than this reopened critical period window.
That's right.
And in humans, psychedelic effects tend to last a bit longer. Do you think the critical opening is longer in humans to be proportional? And also, what sort of correlates might there be of this open window in humans? Like, right. A lot of these things are fast-acting antidepressants, which it hasn't really been part of the discussion today. Do you think that relates to the window or not?
I think that being in that open state of the critical period feels good, right? And so, like the the fast-acting antidepressant effects are just like the happy haze of being in the open state. And so, like ketamine, the open state of the critical period in a mouse lasts about 48 hours, and then after 48 hours, it starts closing, and by a week, it's completely closed. I think that correlates nicely for approximately a week that people feel happy on ketamine after ketamine without therapy. And so I want to be clear that we're not making the case that the open state of the critical period is directly related to the, antidepressant effects. What I'm saying is that open state feels good, and that too many of the clinical trials and too many of the pharmaceutical companies are focusing on that feels good part of it as the therapy. And what I'm saying is, no, that window is your window of opportunity when you are feeling good, but also you're able to learn. And whatever you learn during that that's where the durability comes from. So why this matters is because I think that there are some drug companies, and the new ownership of Lykos, and they have a new name, is pushing this idea that, we don't need to force the drug companies to demonstrate durability. And I think that that's sort of a gimmick, because if you wanted to make, next generation SSRI biochemical imbalance model look the same or as good as psychedelics plus therapy learning model, then you just you don't demand that they show durability, right? Because if you look at the ketamine trials, there's anecdotal, it's not published yet, but I've seen some of these ketamine clinics compare the people who got ketamine by itself, just the rapid antidepressant effects. If you look at 2 weeks, they're identical to the people who got ketamine plus ketamine-assisted therapy. But if you look 6 months out or a year out, the people who got the therapy are the ones that have the durable effects, and everybody else just went to baseline. And so I think that we need to kind of force everybody to take the durability part, because that's the promise, right? That's why we're all here and excited, is because we don't want people to be medicalized for life. We want to be able to give them a treatment that's actually a cure, that, you know, they don't have to keep taking a pill for the rest of their life, that they can resume their lives having recovered. And, you know, in terms of the timeline, you asked about the timeline. It's true that I'm making an assumption about, you know, mouse time to human time. I am making the calculation based on the most conservative. So when I say mouse, the critical period stays open for about 2 weeks in a mouse, I think this is at least 2 weeks in a human, probably more like a month. It's really hard to do the calculation, not only because of differences in how fast the liver metabolizes things in a mouse. Mice are very metabolically active, but also because the mouse to human timeline conversion works well in adulthood, but it's different during development. And since we're returning animals to a younger stage of development, it's hard to do the one-to-one calculation. So we don't know, but just conservatively, I would say at least 2 weeks for MDMA, at least a month for ibogaine. And the mechanism for how that critical period stays open is likely to be different for different drugs, right? So with ibogaine, it's almost certainly having to do with how active the metabolite is and how long that metabolite stays in the body. Whereas LSD, maybe it's, you know, half off rate of the LSD bound to 2A. We don't know. Okay.
I'll bring the mic back there.
Thank you so much for this talk. I've been
Louder.
taking notes left and right. Thank you. I have a question, and this might be outside of your research knowledge, but you're the most knowledgeable person I know. I don't know, but so I have this question about non-hallucinogenic LSD, the JRT that's been, or the various different molecules that have been developed in critical period, and I'm wondering if you have any knowledge about them functioning the same way, like if that critical period is still being opened, and I'm just curious about that.
No, thank you for that question. So we haven't tested any of those molecules directly, so I don't have a direct answer. I will say that I think all of those strategies are likely to fail. I think all of the triplet psychedelics are essentially going back to this older biochemical imbalance model idea. They're treating psychedelics like they're next generation SSRIs. Part of the reason I think that is that some of the focus on this approach has been based on studies that are looking at what psychedelics do to cells in tissue culture. And most of those effects are almost certainly a technical artifact of the tissue culture preparation. And without getting into too many details about that, it's because tissue culture neurons are essentially baby neurons without extracellular matrix, without any of the maturational profiles. So like Delix Pharmaceuticals is a company that has been pursuing this based on a bunch of stuff that they did on tissue that was 6 days in vitro. Those neurons don't even start expressing serotonin receptors until 18 days in vitro. And then all of the things that I'm talking about with critical period don't come on until 60, 70, 80 days. They don't start happening. And so the longest you can keep an organoid alive is roughly like 30, maybe 40 days. But even then, everything's all screwed up, and it's sort of like measuring baby neurons in isolation without any of the mechanisms that are required for constraining plasticity in critical periods normally. And so, and just so you have a sense of like how much this is obvious to neuroscientists who've been studying synaptic plasticity, but totally lost on most chemists, because neuroscientists, for the last 40 years have been pitching this idea, we can plasticity. And my professor, when I was at MIT, he developed, this tissue culture assay. He got hired to be the head of neuroscience at Genentech. And I think they, based on this tissue culture thing, and of the 1,200 molecules they tested, not a single one made it past tissue culture because it's all an artifact. And so we all know in neuroscience that you can spit on a tissue culture dish and get plasticity. Does not mean that it's how the drugs actually work. So be very, very careful when you hear about these companies that are basing these. The other thing I would say to be very careful about, and this is why I hate the term psychoplastogen. It drives me crazy, because psychedelics are not psychoplastogens. They are, what we're describing is metaplasticity, so the ability to induce plasticity change, but not the plasticity itself. And why the difference is the difference between me giving you a pill today and tomorrow you speak Japanese, versus I give you a pill and tomorrow you're able to learn Japanese. So or any one of the 7,000 possible languages in humans, right? Depending on what therapy you're getting, right? And so I think psychedelics are making you able to learn any one of 7,000 possible
and the psychoplastogen is the thing
more
without the trip. There's no trip there.
There's no trip. And then the drug class that does is the psychoplastogens, the true psychoplastogens, although this is clearly not in the marketing part of Delix Pharmaceuticals, is that every single drug of abuse is a psychoplastogen. So heroin, cocaine, alcohol, nicotine, they all induce robust bidirectional plasticity. So those are the psychoplastogens. And psychedelics are not addictive. And in fact, they're our best chance for curing addiction. I just think that the way that this gets messed up by the companies that are trying to push their new patentable new ibogaine that is a psychoplastogen but tripless or tripless LSD for MindMed, or, right? Like, and they're making bogus claims too. So MindMed made this claim that LSD is able to cure anxiety without the trip, but when they asked the people who were actually, doing the research, it turned out that they were like being instructed to kind of no therapy, but it was they were actually providing support and Nolan Williams tried to make a similar claim, like, oh, there's no therapy and there's no therapist, and it's like, yeah, but you're doing preparation, you're doing, you're having supportive help during the trip, and then you're doing 6 days of group therapy. I mean, it doesn't have to be a psychiatrist, you're still doing therapy, right? And so I just think that part of it is because people are worried about how to get it past the FDA, but part of it is also they know that they will be able to make more money if they're not required to pair the psychedelic with a therapy. And so the way they sell that is they say, oh, well, we made it tripless, so you don't need a therapist, it's safe. And right, exactly.
This gentleman had a question with the hat on.
Thanks very much.
Oh, there. It works.
Thank you so much. This is really wonderful. I came a little bit late, so I don't know if you've already addressed this, but so related to like integrating after like having these experiences of being in this sort of open critical window, what does that sort of look like, and is it similar regardless of like the different type of struggle that you're dealing with, or is it pretty much the same? And what does that look like in terms of is it journaling? Is it talk therapy? Is it like exposure in like a social situation? And also, is it different for people that are not dealing with like a DSM disorder versus, just wanting to, the betterment of well people type of thing?
Yeah. I mean, I don't have a clear answer on that. We just haven't devoted enough time to, or, clinical energy to interrogating like what are the exact right things. But I will say anecdotally from talking to the veterans that, they find it to be very, like, especially the Oregon model that we talked about. One of the things the veterans love about the Oregon model is that their support group, the people they went through the experience with, are all local. So they can go and talk to them and still reconnect to this big experience, and that seems to help a lot. I'm not saying that it has to be social, because clearly some people are going through things that are not social, but I do think that the way I think of it is like learning. Like, if you wanted to, and I'll go back to my Japanese example, like if you wanted to learn Japanese, you took psychedelics, you went to Japan, the longer you exposed yourself to Japanese, the more likely you're going to lock in that Japanese learning that you reopened the critical period. If you go home right away and nobody speaks Japanese, even if you had a really big insight and you really understood something huge about Japanese, you're probably not going to lock it in the same way. And so I think that every person's, what they learn about themselves and their, way that they interact with their own emotions and their own memories is going to be unique, but also, we can take analogy from the fact that the reason we have critical periods is because there aren't enough genes in the genome to learn to encode every single behavior. So almost all of our behavior is learned. And it's learned when we're in that open critical period. So if you learn to hate yourself when you were a child, right, that environment that you learned that in, you need to unlearn it. And so you need to provide yourself with the right integration context and the right interactions to unlearn those things.
Some of the stuff I learned when writing the book is, if you can capture the insights, the memory, the images as quickly as you can, it can give you material that you can keep parsing through. And there's some research that says journaling 20 minutes a day,
yeah,
but limited to 20 minutes a day so it doesn't turn into rumination, can be very powerful, and cause a lot of introspection. And another bunch of psychologists I know are doing a lot of integration circles. So this relational thing, just as you were saying, can be very powerful. And you stay in that integration circle for a good period of weeks, so you actually develop. And apparently what comes through the relation can be very powerful, very transformative.
But I will also say, and another idea is you also want to challenge yourself, right? So if let's say you gave up smoking or you gave up heroin, as you get more confident and you're able to rely on your new formed habits, maybe you want to test yourself. Am I resilient to this now? If this is a case, if I was going to smoke when I'm writing, papers and I'm having to concentrate and I'm tired, can I get through that activity without smoking, right? And so I think that the way that the memory gets really locked in is to recall it in all of the other circumstances that it would, normally trigger the behavior you're trying to get rid of, and try and do the other behavior. That's why I think
test,
then. Yeah,
really, the road test.
Not just the road test. I think it's the way to actually bring up those other memories and then reconfigure them.
Got it.
Right.
Got it. Yeah. Andrea.
Hola.
Hola.
Thank you for everything. I speak Spanish, so maybe.
Micrófono.
Okay, gracias. I come back to the part of the. Help me with the language, okay? With the critical period. What is your opinion about the? If it's working in the microdosing, or we have to make only macrodosing for open the critical period? I'm saying microdosing, protocols, for example, 1 month, calibrate personal, or no, only with high level and doses 2 grams, for example, psilocybin.
Right.
Is open or not?
Yeah. So we did look at this, and we found that only the macro doses were reopening the critical period.
Oh.
So when we looked at microdoses of psilocybin and LSD, it didn't, right? And so we don't know if that's because they have no effect or they're just below our detection threshold for what we can measure with this behavior, but we don't have any reason to believe that the microdoses are working. And I think part of that is because it's not just that the drug has to see the receptor. What I think has to happen is that, I'm drawing an analogy to the deprivation state, right? Like you can't just skip one meal or go hang out, binge watch Netflix for a day by yourself and expect to induce deprivation-induced, reopening, right? You're not going to get to that mystical state in just like these short little sections. I think what the neuron is sensing is this is something very, very different from the normal statistics of synaptic firing, right? And so when you do a macrodose, you're essentially overwhelming the synapse. You're flooding the synapse with serotonin. And that's why I think that, SSRIs like Prozac don't reopen critical periods in the same way, because it's just a trickle. And it's not enough to have the neuron say, oh no, something's different, reset, reset, reset. So the other example I give is Zoom. When you go on a Zoom call, if it flickers a little bit, you probably just wait and hope that somebody gets out of their weird pause phase. But if it starts freezing for a really long time, then you hit the reset button, or you log out and log back in, or you go and you reset the modem, right? And so I think the same kind of thing is happening at the neuronal level. It has to see that big dose.
And one thing, you think like before the macro dose, the microdosing maybe help because it's just open the window and maybe like helping to integrate maybe a month or 2 months, or like no, the work is making in the macro is in the macro.
I could see, we don't know. I could see it in either way. So on one hand, I could imagine that the microdosing would just help loosen things up a little bit before and be like a gentle on-ramp for somebody. On the other hand, especially with psilocybin and LSD, they have a very rapid tolerance builds up, and we think that's because for those two drugs, because the receptors are getting internalized. And so it could be that by doing the microdosing before, you're actually preventing the same dose giving you that big overwhelming,
And
overhaul.
Even after, no? Like before microdosing, macro, and then after and before.
Yeah. So I am, all other things being equal, I say macrodose. Okay.
Let's take one more, and then we'll sign some books and do a tour and all the other stuff.
Hi. So you've talked about the correlation between the duration of the trip itself and how long the critical period is open.
Mm-hmm.
Have you looked at 5-MeO-DMT? Because that's a big trip.
Yeah, so I get that question almost every single time. We are eventually going to have to do this experiment. We have not done it. However, my intuition about 5-MeO and just regular DMT is that... Oh, sorry. So 5-MeO-DMT is another psychedelic that people use. It's the one that's derived from frogs. DMT is a psychedelic that if you just smoke it, it's just an inhaled psychedelic, also a serotonin psychedelic. But if you combine DMT in the formulation of ayahuasca, then you absorb it through the oral route, and it's a much slower absorption. So the trip lasts, 8 hours, whereas DMT inhaled or 5-MeO-DMT inhaled, those are very fast, like 20-minute trips, right? And so they are very intense. And so people have speculated, or people who, are big proponents of DMT and 5-MeO say, oh, well, it's just the intensity is so big that should be as good. And our data really suggests that no, they should be something like half as good as ketamine in terms of how long they keep the critical period open, just because of the duration. And the evidence that we have for that is that if we give LSD at 50 times the doses required to reopen the critical period, it also reopens the critical period, but it doesn't stay open for longer, right? So just because it's 50 times as intense doesn't matter that it doesn't keep it open longer. And Ibogaine, some people, especially these gentle teacher types, that can be a very mellow kind of floating along trip. It's not as intense as 5-MeO, but for some people it is, right? Like at Beyond, there are a lot of people who do 3, a flood dose and then a half dose and another third dose of ibogaine, and then they do a top off with 5-MeO as like a fun last day, like the good day, like the cherry on top, right? So for those people, the ibogaine days are the intense days. But again, I think that some of that is about like what you're working through. So in that progression, by the time you get to the 4th trip, you've kind of exercised all your demons, and then you get to just connect with the universe and be happy.
Look at some pretty images coming your way. I know you've all been wondering about my hat, which says my critical period is open. I got it. It's a great conversation starter, I promise you. I got it from an organization which I really like called Psychedelic Alpha. You can order it yourselves. It comes in red, white, blue, and black with different colors of type on it if you're so interested. So Gül, again, thank you. It's always amazing to listen to you.